Most XRP holders have no idea that a real timeline exists behind XRP's future. Not a countdown clock, not a date someone guessed on social media, but a structural timeline buried inside the global financial system itself. A timeline defined by liquidity pressure, macro cycles, settlement requirements, and the quiet adjustments institutions make long before the rest of the world realizes what's happening. And the truth is simple. This timeline was never meant to be obvious. It was never designed for retail eyes. It was meant to operate silently, in the background, until the system reached the point where the old rails could no longer support the world they were trying to carry. Before we get into it, take a second to like this video so more XRP holders get information grounded in research instead of hype. Subscribe to Matrix Millionaire so you stay ahead of every structural shift. And remember, this is not financial advice. As of right now, XRP is trading in the low $2 range. Now let's talk about the timeline that wasn't supposed to leak and what it really means. When people hear XRP timeline, they think of price targets or predictions. But institutions and analysts who understand the architecture of global liquidity think in a completely different way. To them, a timeline is not a date. It is a series of phases the financial system moves through as it becomes increasingly strained by the inefficiencies of delayed settlement. And the moment those phases align, the system is forced to adopt newer, faster, more efficient rails. This is the core of Ripple's long-term messaging. Brad Garlinghouse has repeated publicly that real-time settlement is an inevitability, not a trend, not a hope, but a requirement for a world moving faster every year. David Schwartz has noted that XRP's true utility emerges only when global settlement stress reaches a certain threshold. What neither of them says directly, but what their words imply, is that the system operates on a sequence, a progression of pressure points, a hidden timeline, and we are already in the middle of it. The first phase is gold liquidity compression. Gold is the oldest and most universal settlement benchmark humanity has ever created. When uncertainty rises, gold flows tighten, custodians reposition reserves, and financial institutions begin shuffling liquidity buffers to protect themselves. These movements are slow, but they are the first cracks in the old settlement model. When gold tightens, the system begins a quiet acceleration. The second phase is bond market rotation, and this is the real trigger. Bond markets dictate global liquidity. When yields shift sharply or unpredictably, as they have been, institutions face a settlement burden the old rails were never designed to handle. Massive bond flows must clear quickly, but the delays built into legacy systems create friction, slippage, and capital traps. Institutions cannot tolerate these inefficiencies forever, and the analyst community has pointed this out repeatedly. Bond-driven settlement pressure is one of the clearest signals the timeline is advancing. The third phase is tokenization expansion. This is the phase most retail investors underestimate. Once assets become tokenized, the old rules disappear. There is no downtime, there are no settlement windows, there is no wait until morning. Tokenized assets move continuously. 24 hours a day, across borders, across custodians, across networks. But the current settlement infrastructure cannot support this. The more tokenization grows, the more the system begins to strain. This is the moment where a neutral, globally liquid settlement asset becomes essential. The fourth phase is corridor activation, where institutions begin widening the pathways they plan to rely on once settlement pressure becomes unbearable. Ripple's public reports already show increased activity in these corridors. The market sees nothing. Institutions see the timeline advancing. The fifth phase is OTC tightening, where large buyers can no longer source the volume they need privately. Once OTC pathways thin out, institutions must begin sourcing XRP from the open market. This crossover point is one of the strongest indicators that the timeline is nearing its activation moment. And finally, the sixth phase, the one that was never supposed to leak, is regulatory alignment. Not full clarity, not perfection. Just enough harmonization across major jurisdictions for institutions to begin using new rails without fear of legal inconsistency. When this phase arrives, the old model does not merely weaken, it becomes obsolete. Put all these phases together and you have the hidden XRP timeline. Gold compression, bond rotation, tokenization, corridor activation, OTC tightening, regulatory alignment, system transition. This timeline is not a rumor. It is not speculation. It is the natural sequence of events that occurs when a global liquidity system outgrows its own infrastructure. And the reason it feels hidden is because each phase unfolds in isolation, invisible to retail investors who focus only on charts, but obvious to institutions tracking liquidity stress. The truth is that XRP's timeline is not about waiting. It is about pressure. When the pressure becomes too great for the old system to withstand, the new system activates by necessity. Not hype, not optimism, necessity. Most people will never see this moment coming until it's already here. But you are seeing it now, at the only time it matters, before the transition. In the next section, we're going deeper into how these phases interact, how liquidity pressure accelerates the timeline, and why this sequence is unfolding faster than anyone expected. To understand why the hidden XRP timeline matters, you have to see how each phase interacts with the next, because they don't operate in isolation. They cascade, they accelerate one another. When one phase intensifies, it pushes pressure into the next, tightening the entire system like a coiled spring. This is why the analyst's remarks carried so much weight. He wasn't describing a single event. He was describing a chain reaction already in motion. Let's start at the beginning. Gold liquidity compression. When gold tightens, it's not simply because investors want safety. It's because institutions begin reallocating liquidity buffers across jurisdictions. These movements reveal that confidence in slower settlement mechanisms is weakening. When custodians must reposition gold more frequently, the global settlement system starts absorbing stress. Stress that accumulates quietly, with no headlines until it becomes unavoidable. Now shift to the second phase, bond market rotation. This is where the pressure escalates. Bond markets are the backbone of global liquidity. When yields swing rapidly, financial institutions must rebalance positions across multiple regions and asset classes simultaneously. But these movements require settlement speed the old rails cannot deliver. Modern markets move in seconds. Legacy systems move in days. The gap between those two speeds becomes a systemic risk. What the analyst implied, and without explicitly naming XRP, is that the settlement gap is nearing its breaking point. When bond volatility becomes too fast for delayed settlement to manage, liquidity gets trapped inside the system, and trapped liquidity is the greatest liability a global financial architecture can face. Then comes the third phase, the expansion of tokenization. Tokenization is not a trend, it is the future of how value moves. But here is the part most retail investors miss. Tokenized assets create settlement expectations that legacy systems cannot meet. When tokenized assets can move 24 hours a day, but money required to settle those movements cannot, the system becomes misaligned. Every mismatch adds pressure to the timeline. Institutional operators know this, which is why the rise of tokenization has accelerated their search for real-time settlement solutions. They are not doing this because they want faster rails for the sake of technology. They are doing it because the system demands it. As tokenization grows, the timeline compresses. Now we enter the fourth phase, corridor activation. Ripple does not expand ODL corridors randomly. Each corridor is built where real institutional demand exists. That means banks, remittance companies, and liquidity providers are already testing or preparing to use real-time settlement architecture. When corridor activity increases, it signals that institutions are aligning themselves with the future rails. Most holders never look into this. Yet corridor expansion is one of the clearest indicators of timeline progression. The fifth phase, OTC tightening, is where the public begins to feel the effects without understanding why. Large buyers have relied on Ripple's OTC channels because those pathways avoid slippage and market disruption. But OTC availability is not infinite. Ripple's escrow releases are shrinking. Demand from institutions is rising. And once over-the-counter pathways dry up, institutions will be forced into the open market. This is not a prediction. It is structural mathematics. The moment institutions begin sourcing XRP directly from exchanges rather than privately from Ripple, the timeline enters its next stage. Price elasticity increases, liquidity gaps widen, supply thins. This is the point where the asset transitions from accumulated quietly to repriced aggressively. But none of this happens without the sixth and final phase, regulatory alignment. This does not require perfect global clarity. It requires something far more achievable, enough harmonization across key jurisdictions to give institutions legal confidence in using digital settlement rails. Over the past few years, that alignment has accelerated. Europe, the Middle East, Singapore, and even parts of the United States have shifted from what is crypto to how do we regulate digital settlement assets responsibly. That shift signals the last stage of the hidden timeline. Here is what makes this timeline so powerful. Each phase amplifies the next. When gold tightens, bond volatility increases. When bond volatility increases, the need for fast settlement accelerates. When tokenization expands, slow rails become even more outdated. When corridor activity rises, institutions quietly prepare for change. When OTC availability shrinks, open market sourcing becomes inevitable. And when regulation aligns, the new rails become unavoidable. This is not a sequence controlled by hype or speculation. It is controlled by the mechanics of the global financial system. That is why the analyst's comments were so revealing. He framed XRP's future in the language of macro liquidity, not price, not charts, not news cycles. He described the structural pressures that make the activation of new settlement rails a requirement, not an option. Retail investors often think XRP's moment is delayed because they expect visible announcements or dramatic headlines. They overlook the deeper truth. Institutions adopt new systems only when the old systems can no longer support the world they operate in. That moment is determined by pressure, not by predictions and not by retail sentiment, and the pressure is rising. The hidden timeline is not a single event. It is a slow but unstoppable progression toward a future where real-time settlement is mandatory, a future where only a few assets can bridge global liquidity at the required scale. And the asset that matches all those requirements, neutral, fast, liquid, globally connected, is the one Ripple has been positioning for more than a decade. In the next section, we're going to break down the part of the timeline most holders never consider: behavioral psychology. How retail misreads the signals while institutions follow them with precision, and why this misunderstanding is part of the timeline itself. When you step back and look at the entire sequence, something becomes very clear. The hidden XRP timeline was never about waiting for the perfect headline. It was never about retail excitement or price predictions. It was about pressure, the kind of pressure that builds slowly, silently, until the system reaches a point where it can no longer function without real-time settlement. And the truth is this: that point is approaching, not because anyone says so, but because the world is demanding settlement speed the old rails simply cannot deliver. You can already see the signals if you know where to look. Gold flows tightening. Bond markets rotating faster than legacy systems can clear. Tokenized value moving 24 hours a day, forcing settlement to evolve. Corridors widening. OTC availability thinning. Regulation aligning just enough for institutions to begin positioning. These are not coincidences. They are pressure points. The same pressure points the analyst alluded to when he accidentally revealed more than he intended. He wasn't leaking a date. He was revealing the mechanism that activates the future. And in that mechanism, XRP is not a speculative asset. It is infrastructure. Most holders won't realize this until the transition is already underway. They will look back and see that the timeline was visible the entire time. Not in charts, but in the behavior of the global financial system. But you see it now. You understand the phases, you understand the pressure, and you understand what XRP becomes when the system finally shifts from delayed settlement to real-time liquidity. Before you go, support the research that helps you stay ahead of the noise. Tap like, subscribe to Matrix Millionaire, and comment timeline if you're one of the few who now understand the sequence the world was never supposed to notice. Your clarity is now your advantage.